Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the NECE campus. My name is Camelia Tomova, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this meeting today. I'm sitting here together with my colleague Sevdalina at the Sofia Hub of the Civics. And we are very, very excited about today's session. It's going to look at how political narratives circulated during the April 2026 Bulgarian parliamentary election campaign. And more broadly, what this tells us about trust, manipulation, and democratic participation in such increasingly fragmented digital environments. We are very happy to have with us Dr. Peter Kiely, research group lead at the Gate Institute here in Sofia and scientific coordinator of the Bulgarian-Romanian Observatory of Digital Media. Keith works at the intersection of social science and computational analysis, focusing on things like misinformation, propaganda, identity politics, and the ways manipulative narratives spread online. His work combines discourse analysis with digital tools that help identify emotional triggers, logical fallacies, coordinated messaging, and broader patterns linked to what is increasingly described as cognitive warfare. And as a Bulgarian myself, I'm very interested to hear what you have to tell us about this particular election campaign, Keith. Thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and I'll just share my screen. Thank you all for joining this particular meeting, and I'm very appreciative, everybody. I know your time is valuable, so thank you for joining, and hopefully it's something helpful for everybody. So yeah, as was pointed out, I'm the scientific coordinator at the Bulgarian-Romanian Observatory on Digital Media, which is part of the EDMO network. And as such, we are responsible for working with partners in the region, looking at how different trends within false and misleading information spread, what types of methods of conveyance are used, and how people interpret different types of messaging around these particular issues. So this work was actually done as part of the rapid response mechanism that was facilitated by the European Commission, where we worked with some of the platforms, the major platforms, to flag to them any false or misleading content by the definitions of their internal standards for review with these particular platforms. So the findings that we have came from a 5-week monitoring project that examined this environment within Facebook. It's limited to Facebook, this particular analysis, during the run-up to and the week following the April 2026 parliamentary elections here in Bulgaria. And the team at the Gate Institute, as was alluded to in the introduction, we utilized a multi-dimensional analytical framework. That is, we used a framework with multifaceted framework to identify narrative patterns, rhetorical structures, and emotional mobilization strategies during a period of very high political volatility. For any of us here in Bulgaria, I think it's maybe obvious to say that the election now, in hindsight, was historically significant. It was, to run it first, it was the 8th parliamentary election in just 5 years, a period of very high political instability, lack of stable governance. And at this point, particularly, we see that elections themselves had kind of stopped functioning purely as democratic procedures and begin to symbolize something deeper, an exhaustion aimed at towards this instability and fundamentally the cracks of institutional breakdown. So our research was approaching the election not simply as a political contest, or even to just figure out what was true and what was false within the elections, but as a crisis of meaning. That's how we approached anything around the campaigning for this election, that it would represent an inherent crisis of meaning. So rather than just fake news or isolated cases of misinformation, how do the narratives themselves structure political understanding? How do citizens themselves make sense of this level of political instability? What role do emotional stories have? Do they become more persuasive or less persuasive than institutional facts? And why do people increasingly trust symbolic narratives over isolated? Why do they continue to trust symbolic narratives over official expertise, over scientists? Also, we wanted to look at things like how do digital ecosystems transform political frustration into genuine political action? And while we use many different methodological and theoretical approaches at Gate, the one we tend to use here was we're drawn heavily from Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist philosopher. Concepts such as hegemony, crisis of authority, passive revolution. I'll go into these in a bit more detail, so you don't have to worry about them right now. But these concepts we felt were very good at operationalizing what we were seeing within data sets and helping us to interpret Bulgaria's election cycle, not simply as political turbulence, but part of a broader corrosion of institutional legitimacy and shared public meaning. The central argument is that Bulgaria entered a period where, at least in the narrative sense, in what we're seeing people posting about, this is not to confuse it with fact, but in a narrative sense, the old transition model no longer retains sufficient moral or intellectual authority to sustain public trust. And because of the collapse of that trust, an informal vacuum emerges. Into that vacuum, we see very clearly emotional narratives move, existential rhetoric, conspiratorial frameworks, and most importantly for this data set, a symbolic savior narrative or figure metaphor. These are just an introduction, basic introduction to the kind of dynamic forms of the core of the findings in today's discussion. So, as I said, we're going to discuss these findings of this 5-week monitoring project. The goal, of course, as I said, we weren't just cataloging misinformation. We want to understand the political meaning being constructed actively during the campaign and circulated within the digital environment. Across the thousands of posts, and there was about 7,500 posts from Facebook, comments and interactions, what we observed were several recurring emotional and symbolic themes. So distrust in institutions, anti-system sentiment, narratives of betrayal, existential political framing, as I said earlier, and the increasing replacement of policy debate with a more emotional form of storytelling around political issues. The information environment was not chaotic in the sense that it was random. It was highly structured. Specific rhetorical mechanisms were repeated and appeared across different communities and different ideological groups. So we were not only focused on what people were saying, but how the narratives operated psychologically and socially, how they managed to gain traction. What rhetorical structures actually increased or decreased engagement, what types of narratives became highly actionable, why were some forms of persuasion more difficult, and all those kinds of things. So what I want to try and do is, without going into and being too, going on too long and seeing, boring everybody, I want to try and give a general overview of the terms and the context used, of the what I mean by Bulgaria's organic crisis, about what weak hegemony and information environment mean, what I mean by the war of position and geopolitical mirrors and what that means in the data set, what is passive revolution and local feudalism within this data set and the narratives found there, what represents an absence of intellectual leadership, and how, based on all of these things, what conclusions, what can we take from this to help us to build cognitive resilience in our societies going forward? So hegemony, I guess the best way to kind of put it is to say it's kind of like a shared house of beliefs where the kind of more or less, this is very simplistic, more or less the dominant group convinces society that their vision for that society is the only natural or common sense way to live. So, in a stable hegemonic system, people obey institutions not simply because they fear punishment or there's violence or anything like that, but because they believe the system itself is legitimate. In Bulgaria, the transition from state communism after 89 can be kind of understood in this sense as being what's called a passive revolution, which is a top-down revolution, where change comes from the top level and is filtered down to the population rather than developing from grassroots and developing upward. In the Bulgarian case, then, the argument has been made by several academics over the years, and I would agree with it, that essentially what happened was the facade was repainted with the language of modernization, democracy, liberalization, and European integration. But over time, many citizens increasingly felt that the deeper power structure remained unchanged. This produced what I categorize or describe, or our team categorizes and describes as weak hegemony. The system functions on an institutional level, but it's never fully stabilized in terms of its moral or intellectual or public trust standing. The house of the transition, in this sense, was perpetually under construction. Eventually, of course, the conclusion of this is that it leads to a profound crisis of authority, where citizens increasingly lose faith with the official story of the transition or anything else. Following this particular election in 2026, we're still left with a question. Is it true, this narrative, that the old transition house effectively collapsed with the victory of Rumen Radev's progressive Bulgaria, who secured 44% of the vote, 131 seats? Many people on Facebook, for example, agreed with the narrative that this was not simply an electoral victory, but evidence that the post-89 political model had lost its legitimacy entirely. Many narratives describe the political system as a pigsty or Augean stables or requiring a total purge. This language was very, very common. What do we mean by the analytical void? Well, the analytical void is essentially a meaning vacuum. It emerges when institutional trust collapses to the point where people stop relying on official expertise, policy analysis, or explanations. Instead, dramatic emotional narratives can move into this empty space, and political interpretation becomes increasingly existential in tone. What are high susceptibility fallacies? So our team focuses on developing kind of media literacy and education materials around recognizing logical fallacies, and that fed into this particular methodology. So these are rhetorical shortcuts that are designed to bypass rational thinking and target instinctive emotional reactions. They're particularly dangerous because they are empirically much more difficult for average citizens to identify as manipulative or platforms. Common sense appeals, symbolic enemy construction, survival-based rhetoric, a single emotional story from a teacher or a farmer or a plumber may feel more persuasive than the most extensive statistical evidence. What do we mean by crisis of authority? Well, I've kind of gone into it a little bit, but in plain terms, it means losing faith with the referee. Citizens no longer believe that the institutions that are meant to be publicly serving institutions, such as the prosecution, police, electoral commissions, they don't believe they're neutral anymore. Instead, these institutions are interpreted as partisan tools or as protecting elite interests. Then we have what's called digital ripples within the study. So, of course, that is the idea that information doesn't simply drift alone in cyberspace. It moves through coordinated waves. Narratives often begin with major influencers, or what we referred to in the study as digital megaphones, and then spread into smaller echo chambers where they become emotionally reinforced and much harder to challenge. What does actionability mean? Actionability refers to a capacity of a narrative to transform engagement online into real world behavior. A successful narrative doesn't merely generate clicks, okay? It should motivate people to vote, to protest, to boycott, to mobilize, or to demand some form of institutional change. I'm nearly done with these. I know it's probably tedious. Ideological mirroring. Well, this is a process of using political developments in other places, other countries, Hungary, United States, Romania, um, to mirror them for Bulgaria. They become emotionally repurposed to suggest similar political trends, waves, transformations are inevitable in Bulgaria. And finally, weak hegemony and organic crisis. So weak hegemony ultimately means power without respect. The ruling order retains procedural authority, but loses moral legitimacy. An organic crisis, on the other hand, occurs when the older order is dying, but the new order has not yet stabilized. This produces a permanent instability and a constant search for some form of solution, some form of savior, or some form of institutional solution. Of course, I'm sure we all know what identity-based sharing is. I'm a patriot, I'm anti-corruption, I see the truth, you're a sheep, whatever. That type of I belong to this group and I share it because of my belongingness to this particular group. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the data, some of the information about the study of 7,525 unique posts from week 1 to week 5. Okay, so first of all, according to the definition that we started with about weak hegemony, the narratives uncovered within the data set, they strongly reflect that condition. The first major finding concerns institutional authority. So in the posts, discourse we observed it shifting from procedural uncertainty in the early weeks up until a total rejection of institutional legitimacy and the idea of a total purge in the week following the election. The election was April 19th. But you can see it takes different steps. The narrative develops in a very specific way. The electoral process itself was increasingly framed as fundamentally fraudulent or performative. And it wasn't fringe rhetoric. It became normalized language. The second major kind of thing about that suggests a weak hegemony is that, let's say, what we called in the data set informally the 72-0 framework. Because one of the narratives identified during the monitoring period referred to the public perception that the Ministry of the Interior had identified extensive evidence of electoral violations, while the prosecution ultimately pursued zero meaningful accountability measures. This was around vote buying. So narratively, the prosecution ceased to appear as a neutral referee. Instead, it was framed as a partisan club protecting elite networks who were engaged in this type of activity. The third finding involves that analytical void that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So when institutions lose legitimacy, citizens increasingly abandon official analysis and instead they turn towards, as I said multiple times, emotionally satisfying interpretive systems, conspirative reasoning, moral absolutism, spiritual prophecy appeared, karmic explanations appeared, existential symbolism. Politics became interpreted less through policy and more through morality and destiny. Not something unique to Bulgaria, but interesting to see the manifestations it took within the data set. And as I said earlier, the fourth finding was about this savior narrative, the idea of the rise of a savior. The collapse of support for Gerb, whose leader at one point embodied this savior narrative, Boris Boykov, and Pepe Debe to historic lows, 12 to 14%. That was interpreted by people on Facebook as the rejection of the post-89 passive revolution of the transition period. Radev's Progressive Bulgaria, Radev being the former president who last year as well spoke out in favor of a referendum on the euro being adopted in Bulgaria, which didn't happen. The euro was adopted, but formed his own party and ran for government in this particular election cycle. He was framed by many actors as a cleansing force having the capability essentially to liquidate the backstage. And finally, I think what was also interesting in these particular posts that we took on Facebook is that we could see evidence of weak hegemony at the regional level. In areas like the Rhodopes and in Kargeli, political control, was repeatedly framed not as consensual leadership, but as economic coercion. Narratives described vulnerable populations being threatened with the loss of things like warm lunch programs or firewood access or municipal support. So these stories transformed kind of national political distrust into immediately recognizable personal survival narratives for people in those types of regions. Here we have a graph. It's just looking, as I said, it's the war of position graph. What one is that one you see? The war of position graph? Is that what you're seeing now? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Evidence of weak hegemony.
Sorry, evidence of weak hegemony. That's the one you see. Okay. So we've already looked at this. Each period you can see, as I said a minute ago, you see a change in the focus around institutional um, distrust, procedural uncertainty. Then you have this was during the period of a pact with Ukraine, March 30th to April 5th. And also, of course, tensions were rising between the US and Iran during this period. There was also during this period a claim that the government was hiding a letter from Iran, Iran was going to strike Sofia. There was a lot of this type of geopolitical existentialism to mirror what was happening in geopolitics in that particular moment. Then, as you see again in the next step, the election results in Hungary created this Hungarian mirror idea that Bulgaria was now going to take its point of overthrowing a long-term regime to kind of do a kind of a clean house, right? That became that type of mirror. Then we have allegations of systemic sabotage. Not unsurprising, right? Right up until voting day from the last week of the election to see the narrative shift towards allegations of machine sabotage and framing it as strictly a choice between voting for the savior figure or voting for the mafia, right? And then you have the post-election results there. So I'll just leave it at that. So what Gramsci refers to as the war of position, looking at that through what I've explained as being political mirrors. Well, the war of position to start with, that's a term that refers to a long-term ideological struggle over public consciousness, over public opinion. When state legitimacy weakens, information warfare becomes a battle over interpretation itself. When the epistemic ground becomes sufficiently weak, that creates a very highly contestable environment. Disinformation, therefore, is functioning not merely as deception, but it's a weapon for constructing an alternative moral order. One of the strongest examples in the data is what we just talked about here, the Hungarian mirror, where narrative actors were using events in Hungary to manufacture that sense of inevitable momentum for Bulgarian anti-establishment forces like Radev. The logic wasn't policy-based. It wasn't even analysis based on Bulgaria itself per se. It was emotional and historical. The message was history is moving in this direction, Bulgaria is next. So this is what we would classify as very highly actionable rhetoric because it bypasses rational scrutiny and instead activates emotional alignment. Who doesn't want to be part of a historic wave, right? Especially if you believe that the country needs change. What we also saw, and something we also looked at last year in the data, was a discussion about the Romanian presidential elections in 2025 and the annulment of the first round, the victory of Calin Georgiescu, the right-wing pro-Russia candidate there. So that scenario functioned differently within this data set, but it appeared. The narrative claimed that Brussels or some external actors, usually unnamed, maybe George Soros is attached, that they would attempt to sabotage the Bulgarian election. So by preemptively framing any kind of institutional oversight as illegitimate, anti-establishment actors inoculated supporters against contradictory evidence. And the very obvious example of that was when the MFA, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, set up a counter disinformation unit specifically for the elections, and they were attacked. They were being called censors and all these types of things, right? So, as we were saying, we believe that that is part of a strategy to inoculate your supporters against any legitimate contradictory evidence. Any criticism becomes then, censorship, or it can be reframed as proof of some conspiracy on the governmental level to stop you from speaking your truth or whatever it may be. The other thing was that we noticed that there was a use of global archetypes. And I guess, again, because of the temporally bound period we looked at, it's not surprising that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance were symbolically deployed within narratives as ideological mirrors. Bulgarian domestic struggles were kind of our value struggles or narratives, competing narratives around values were reframed as part of a global conflict between this kind of one group as being the party of common sense and the other one being the party of madness. Surprisingly, in this narrative, Trump or Vance belong to the party of common sense, not the party of madness. So the purpose is not a detailed political comparison. The purpose is, again, emotional identification. You are engaged in this kind of war over values that it's important for you to fight because something is being taken from you. The strategic outcome of these mirrors was that the preservation of the analytical void was assured because nothing was being analyzed, no hard information was being analyzed, no local policy proposals, no national policy proposals. Instead, voters were interpreting politics through existential global narratives involving sovereignty, betrayal, and some form of civilizing conflict or culture war. And this encourages citizens to seek out a strong protector rather than a democratic compromise, in our view, this type of an environment. So, yeah, you can see passive revolution and regional feudalism, I'm hoping. So we talked about the Hungarian mirror. Yeah, sorry, I've lost my place. So yeah, the legacy of passive revolution, according to the narratives we found, were that there is a captured state and what was often referred to as a model WHO kind of structure in place, a kind of a puppet government. There was also a strong link to what was looked at, as I said earlier, regional feudalism, what was described as regional feudalism, the Viliettes. Provinces like the Rhodops and Karjali were framed as vilayets. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Territories ruled by local derebes, feudal lords from the established status quo parties, GERB, Pepe de Bay, whoever you like, BSP, all the rest of them. Um, Economic coercion was very commonly framed as modern slavery in regions like Cosino and Opaka. These are alleged narratives around economic coercion, and local power holders were basically utilizing debt-based control according to these narratives. That's why they termed it modern slavery. Also, there was this narrative around weaponizing basic needs, vulnerable voters in regional areas facing threats like the loss of the programs, the warm lunch program or the access to firewood, if they didn't vote in a particular way. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence around this, which is why it's not surprising to see this in the Facebook posts. But actually pinning down the actual evidence for this will be much more difficult. Um, and then, of course, administrative sabotage. So local administrations are accused of things like stealthy coercion, shifting polling station locations last minute, this to try and stop older people from voting, et cetera, confusing people, all that kind of stuff. Again, the collapse of the absence of intellectual authority was another key issue that we observed within the data set. It was what we would generously, sorry, describe as a vacuum of trusted expertise. One of the major tactics, for example, that we we identified in the data was reframing legitimate expertise as some form of censorship, as I said earlier. Experts, analysts, journalists, academics, civil society groups, all increasingly portrayed as foreign proxies or gatekeepers or actors who are hiding the truth. And this creates, what we describe as in the research as the expert silence trap. Once that expertise loses legitimacy, rational policy debate becomes very, very difficult, and it deepens the analytical void. Citizens are left very, very little choice but to rely on fear, outrage, symbolic identity, and an emotional intuition. I mean, that's one of the striking trends of this thing. I mean, things like the data which demonstrated esoteric expertise as an answer, right? So tarot readings, things like that will predict the outcome of this election and who's going to win and who's going to lose. Or karmic narratives, what's happening now to Bulgaria is because of the karma that it built in the past, etc., etc. Or prophetic interpretations relying on the old favorite of Baba Vanga and things like this. Those things increasingly functioned as alternative systems of political explanation. It's quite worrying to see. Political outcomes were framed not as institutional processes, but as manifestations of destiny. And this kind of neutralizes very quickly any attempt at rational democratic discourse. How do you argue rationally against manifest democratic destiny? What we did though in the research to try and help inform our media literacy efforts was to categorize many of these mechanisms, as many as we felt met the categorization as high susceptibility fallacies. Things like emotional anecdotes, a teacher testimony, or stories about a shepherd by Riban, a narrative that was more something that you could tell users felt it was more emotionally authentic than institutional reports or statistical evidence about the plight of shepherds in particular regions. Identity-based sharing, this type of emotional anecdote, sorry, resulted in ultimately identity-based sharing. The absence of intellectual leadership produced, this void, this moral and intellectual void where, substantive discussion could be had on a kind of an even playing. Without kind of a factual ground, political choices became increasingly simplified into choosing between, either the saviors or the monsters. Um, and this dramatically intensified the polarization and polarization within the data set and weakened any kind of strong signals of democratic consensus that we would say would be necessary for having foundational institutional stability. Finally, I don't want to go through. I think we've discussed all this. I think we can leave it here, and I can open the floor up to questions. I think I'm a little bit over time. Um, but yeah, these are the key kind of things that we wanted to take away from this, and most importantly, for us at least, is that we ensure that these findings are not just interesting findings for people to read if they're even interesting for some people, but that they can be fed into educational models. And I think what's clear looking at any of this data out of any topic is the need for us to invest as societies into rebuilding our educational structures to meet the needs of the digital environment, of the digital age. Often I liken it to, what needed to happen after the invention of the printing press or what needed to happen after the Industrial Revolution. Certain foundational elements of society needed to be restructured to meet the changed environment, the changed world. And I think we should be trying always with our work, with our research, at least from the research side, to ensure that anything we take out of these data sets can be plugged in somewhere else to help develop cognitive resilience, to help people identify things like high arousal triggers, to encourage people to have a second thought pause, for people to not just accept the simplistic saviors versus monsters type of narratives, to demand more, right? And I think, hopefully with all of the stuff we have going on at the moment, all with the the deluge of bad information, that good information will become, for want of a better word, sexy again, right? That it will be attractive for people to know proper things and to know them well and to understand things in nuance rather than having these binary or simplistic narratives. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much for this analysis. To me, it was basically a unique overview. And since we've heard so many political analysis after the elections and during the election campaign, this was a very fresh perspective, and I really, really appreciated it. And I'm sure you will be able to maybe comment on some other examples from your practice, but just to, from a civic education perspective, and if I may start with the first question, and I want to invite all the others to join me after that. So throughout your presentation, one thing became very clear, very visible, and through your work, that manipulation nowadays is something that is not simple or isolated at all. And so we see narratives are very layered, emotional, often rooted in, let's say, existing social tensions. From your perspective, what would make societies particularly vulnerable to these kinds of narrative clusters?
Yeah, that's interesting because there are peculiarities, there are local specificities that are important for each area, and I think each country has its own particular vulnerability spots that could be identified. But I think that we can look at things like the defunding of epistemic structures, right? So policies that have left public institutions and things like journalism, education initiatives, these types of things have been left without very much public funding or with scraps for public funding, very much underfunded and hollowed out over time. And this helps to kind of add to what we refer to as the expert silence trap. You know, if you have concentrated media ownership, if you have news deserts like you have in the US, for example, if you have a lack of investment in civic education and things like this, then I think and proper standards and the news industry is one example of how standards slip for engagement and profit and monetization and all of these types of things. So that kind of defunding in principle or devaluing of epistemic structures, which are really important for us to be able to have that basic reality in which we can have discussion. Um, I also think, without being condescending to any people who believe in some of the narratives that we looked at, is there is the difficulty of lived experience. You know, there is often a very sharp contradiction between the promise of what our political systems offer us and what we experience. I mean, I guess most of us here are very lucky to be privileged and from privileged backgrounds. But for many people, it's not, it's a much more difficult environment, and it's becoming more difficult in terms of housing, in terms of cost of living. You know, when people like me, let's say, feel this, who live relatively comfortably, I can't imagine what it is for people who have this lived experience. And that lived experience is essentially a failure of policy, whether it's a policy on a national level or on a more multinational level. It's a failure of economic policy to help protect people, the most vulnerable in society, in my opinion. So when you have that, you open up a space, you allow oxygen for narratives of distrust and conspiracy to thrive, because you give people a reason, might not be a good one, but you give them a reason why their life is terrible, right? And you say, this is why, whatever that reason is, refugees, gay people, whatever it is, you give them that reason. And people who are living in very desperate times might be willing um, to listen to any kind of answer, as we see. Lots of people will listen to any radical answer as long as it offers something different from the mainstream, right? And that's the kind of space that these things thrive in, that you can make up really anything in. And lastly, I would say, it's related, I suppose. In Bulgaria specifically, I think one of the major things that's contributed to the specificity of the Bulgarian environment is the kind of failure of the transition in principle, and how the facade that was left post 89 and the structures which were basically, the old, with some differences, the old structures left intact with a new coat of paint. This led to kind of a situation in Bulgaria where there was a kind of as a foreigner here, it was very strange, right? It was kind of like a nod wink, kind of thing where everybody understood that there was a captured state situation, right? That there was corruption and it was endemic, right? So that's when you have an environment where an actual conspiracy is happening, then it's much easier to convince people that any conspiracy is happening. You people are much more open to that when they see that there is kind of evidence of corruption within endemic within their society, and they understand it. So there are things we can do, I think, to try and plug all those gaps, but those are for me the more try to give one local, but the more general issues. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is very helpful indeed. I'm going to read out loud a question from Professor Herman Apps. Hello, Herman. Very nice that you have joined us today. You mentioned that journalism is losing its legitimacy in the described process. I'm wondering how journalism itself can contribute to gain legitimacy back, and how the understanding of journalism can be supported in education when education might suffer of being delegitimized itself. Thank you, Herman.
This is an excellent, really, really great question. Yeah, journalism, how it can lend itself to gaining back some legitimacy. Yeah, you see, if I say something like, well, they can help build back trust by transparency, by being more kind of open about their business models and about how they do things and how their editorial practices work. But I think a lot of media outlets do that. I think it's more about the fundamental issue of the business model to generate revenue. Mainstream media need to get attention. And that has with it a slippery slope, right? Where if you need to gain attention, then you might try things like sensationalist headlines or big emoji things. And if you don't, you might not be able to compete. The thing I've heard floated a lot is this idea of having kind of this paid level for quality journalism, but I find that a bit maybe could I don't know, I'm not an expert in journalism, but for me it might make the situation worse because then you have two classes of information. You have quality information if you can afford it, and if you can't, then you have to swim in the sea of whatever's out there, the sewage that's left there for free. Um, so I'm not so sure fundamentally if journalism as it currently stands functions in this environment without being sensationalist and without fundamentally compromising its legitimacy or its trust. But maybe I'm too skeptical, right? It's possible there's some way. My idea has, and my again, academic stuff probably not practically very, very useful, but I think it's possible within this in this contemporary environment that you could have an educational or a journalism that's more citizen based, that's more focused regionally, that in kind of endows trust more naturally. Because if you know your regional reporters, if you live in the same area, you're more likely to accept what they say as being trustworthy rather than faceless PR release coming from the head office of News Corp or whatever, right? So it's a difficult question, and I don't want to sound too pessimistic on the state of journalism. It's just I find it difficult to see how they regain legitimacy within this current environment as it currently stands. Um, and then education is a great point because education is now something, as I mentioned, kind of in the defunding epistemic structures, education is something that has been under attack for a long time as well. And we kind of forget it sometimes that education itself is something that is being commodified, commercialized, and becoming very much a product rather than an endeavor. And that's, I think, very problematic. I mean, a lot of us, I'm sure, know the pressures of publish and perish, secure funding. All of our organizations are involved in that kind of thing. And, it might be if that really, like Bulgaria, for example, it hinders a lot of things. in Bulgaria, it hinders effective cooperation sometimes because you're competing in the same space for the same money with the same people. And that is not a good facilitator of the development of a kind of a variety of viewpoints on how to deal with any of these issues. So yeah, I don't know what to say about education. It is in danger of being delegitimized, absolutely. But how do we deal with that? I mean, I don't know. I really don't.
And we have one more question, and I think looking at the time, maybe this is going to be our last one. Um, so this one comes from Mila. If you follow Romania as well, are there any major similarities or major differences you notice in the development and functioning of narratives during elections? Thank you, Mila.
Thank you, Mila. Yeah, there are some indeed. Um, the major difference I think to start with would be that the narratives here in Bulgaria um, they're embedded and variations on narratives you would see in Romania, but have, again, as I said earlier, there's local specificities that are bound to particular conversations within Bulgaria. But general things like anti-EU narratives, they function along the same pathways. You know, they activate this idea of imperial Brussels and some form of sovereignty loss and you know, national identity loss and culture loss and all these types of things, and an enforcement of you know, Western woke philosophy on the population. So those things go across. Also, in terms of refugees, the Ukrainian war, there are narratives there that overlap, less so on the war because I guess Romania is, I mean, it was at least more anti-Russian than Bulgarian society, generally speaking. So, you know, the war narratives were slightly different in their structure, but yeah, similar tropes. Um, and in terms of now, as I said in the presentation, the direct link being drawn is the case from Callan Georgiescu from last year, in terms of legitimacy of institutions and in terms of legitimacy of elections in particular. But this narrative is a kind of a wider umbrella narrative that again fits under that Brussels is trying to coerce rather than allowing Romania or Bulgaria to make their own decisions about their national leaders. The idea being that if there's a sniff that the national leader will be in some way pro-Russian or anti-EU, then yeah, this person will be eliminated. The democratic process will not be allowed to continue, or something like this. So generally, yeah, there are some similarities. There are some smaller ones too, but you know, around Roma and around things like that. But it's yeah, generally speaking, there are some very large kind of meta threads, but then you have these local kind of variations of each one. Yeah.
Well, from our side, I can tell that we learned quite a lot today, and thank you for that, Keith. I wish we can continue the conversation because it is an important one, and let's stay involved. And for everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. Please keep following us and our work.